So I want to talk about the psychology of success. And I want to use what I think is a very extreme example, which is boxing, to illustrate something that I find interesting when I think about people that are successful and when I look at some of the experiences that they go through. And so let's first talk about the lifestyle and the life of a boxer, right? And so your typical boxer begins boxing in their single digit age years, 6, 7, 8, 9 years, right? And they start off as an amateur, right? Which is predominantly just fighting in tournaments all across the country. And you're in tournaments, you're training all year round. There's no real off season as an amateur boxer. And so, your typical boxer will finish their amateur career with, say, 100 or so fights, and then they will turn pro. And understand one thing about boxing, right? When in terms of the things that makes it the most difficult sport that you can take on, right? And this has been proven through ESPN that boxing is the most difficult sport. So the obvious reasons why it's so difficult is the fact that whenever you step in a ring, you're literally putting your life in danger, right? That's the obvious part, right? And also there's a factor that when you lose a basketball match or a football match or a tennis match, psychologically, it's not that hard to get over that, right? You're bummed because you lost, but you don't have a visceral reaction to taking that loss the way that you could with boxing. Boxers that endure a loss where they sustain a beating over the course of many rounds, or even sometimes when they're knocked out cold in front of millions of people, that type of loss can have the same mental trauma as someone that has been physically assaulted, because that's exactly what's happened. The fact that it's being done under the context of a sport doesn't make it any better, especially considering the fact that it likely happened in front of millions of people. And so that's the reason why boxers can take one loss, and if it's a bad enough loss, they can never be the same afterwards. And it has nothing to do, or very little to do, with their actual physical abilities. It's all with their mentality. So there's a very, very thin line between riding high as a boxer and hitting the ultimate lows. And it can happen over the course of one punch, right? But one of the other less obvious aspects that makes boxing so difficult is what happens and what's required outside of the ring, right? So going back to the example of the amateur boxer that's training year round because they have tournaments year round, right? So they never really get out of shape, right? They're training all year round. And when it comes to being in shape or conditioning in boxing, there's really three levels, right? You can be out of shape, you could be in shape, or you could be in fighting shape, right? So a fighter that's in shape, quote unquote, can walk into virtually any gym, do 8, 9, 10 rounds with relative ease, right? But they still may not be able to do 10, 12 hard rounds in an elite level boxing match in front of the crowd and when the lights are on, right? Fighting shape is completely different than just being in shape. And if fighting shape represents being at 100% and being in shape represents 70%, if you're a boxer and you're an amateur and you're fighting all year round in tournaments, you're never going to dip below that 70, 80% because you're constantly training, because you're constantly competing, right? And so what happens is once a boxer turns from amateur to a pro, they typically are still pretty busy. They might fight every 6 weeks to 2 months, right? A new prospect or a new fighter may fight 6, 7, 8 times per year. And so again, they're basically competing all year round, which means that they never really give themselves an opportunity to get below 70% conditioning or in shape. Now also, the vast majority of boxers, their main dream is to become a world champion. They don't think too far oftentimes beyond once they become a champion. Like, most of the time, most guys become champions in their 20s, right? So then the question is, what happens afterwards? Many boxers don't think about what happens afterwards. They spend their entire lives wanting to be the world champion, right? And so now they're a professional. They're fighting 6, 7, 8 times a year. They're not making that much money. No one really knows who they are, right? Maybe they're making $500 to $2,000 per fight, right? So they have to stay busy just to maintain their actual livelihood, right? And they haven't accomplished that goal of being a champion. So all of that means is they have a ton of motivation and a ton of inspiration to get up and run those miles and do the road work and do everything that it requires to be a top level boxer, right? But then they start to get some success, right? They start to knock out and beat notable opponents. They start to get TV time. Their purses or their checks start to get into the six figures and then ultimately 7-figure level, right? And now it happens. They become a world champion. And they've also potentially had some multi-million-dollar paydays. And so now they're comfortable. And guess what? They're also probably only fighting twice a year, maybe 3 times a year. So there's a lot more time in between fights. So let's add this up, right? A fighter spends virtually all of their life in constant compete mode, right? Discipline, never drinking, never going out partying, constantly sacrificing because there's no off season as an amateur boxer or as a prospect as a professional, right? And then almost typically over the course of 3 to 4 years, they go from that lifestyle to now being a multi-millionaire, only having to fight twice a year and being a world champion, checking off the box that they had as a goal since they were 7, 8 years old. And it's crazy because oftentimes this happens in their mid to late 20s. Now imagine being in that situation and then you start to understand how the most dangerous time for any boxer is when they're at the height of their career. Because it's at that moment in their career, all of the motivation and the reasons that they took on the journey of becoming a boxer in the first place have already been realized. And now they have to still find the discipline and the motivation to put in the same level of work, if not more, to stay at that level. And that is where the mindset and the mentality comes in, and it's incredibly difficult for most people to be able to do that. And here's the other part about this equation is something else happens too at that moment when they finally become a champion and they become rich and all this kind of stuff. And this happens to a lot of people, whether you're a boxer or just a professional or an entrepreneur, right? You spend all your life and all your time chasing this goal, and then you finally reach it, and then you experience it, and you're like, this is it? I mean, this is cool, but you realize that all those insecurities, all those fears, all those doubts, all those issues you had within yourself are still there. You can just sulk them in buying, expensive cars and vehicles and women. But those issues that you have deep within yourself, oftentimes those things that motivate you out of insecurity to be great are still there. The success doesn't solve that. And a crazy thing happens to a lot of people is they subconsciously can begin to resent their own success and thus act in ways to destroy it and unravel it. You wonder why people that have everything can sometimes have behaviors that are basically putting them in a position to risk losing it all, because they may actually subconsciously resent their success because it didn't solve their problems. It didn't make them happy. And once you accomplish everything that you set out that you want to accomplish in life, and you realize that it's not really the magic stick, the magic key, that can be a very daunting thing to realize. And it takes a very strong person to figure out a way to continue to move forward and progress, even in spite of realizing that. And so it's amazing, man. Success is a crazy thing because there's a lot of people that never achieve it because they actually destroy their own success before it starts because they're scared of the changes that come with being successful. And then there's some people that achieve success and then they basically destroy it in self-destructive ways because they secretly resent it, because it didn't fulfill them the way that they expected. And you see this unravel in front of our eyes with celebrities and athletes and stars every single day. If you know how to pay attention to it, you can see the signs. And it's for me as a keen observer of human behavior and social sciences, is fascinating, but it can also be heartbreaking. So just one of the things to realize for those of you guys out there that's out there chasing success and chasing ambition, please try to make sure that you appreciate the process and don't get too caught up on the destination, because you will soon realize when you do reach that destination that, number one, there's much more life to live beyond that, and you have to be able to stay motivated to keep going. And the best way to do that is to fall in love with the process, not the destination. I could talk a lot more about this topic than I am, but this is already over 10 minutes, so I'm going to stop right there. Peace.